Hello, my name is Joshua Goodstadt, and for this presentation, I will be discussing my idea of implementing Dixon Chibanda's friendship bench model within the Indigenous communities. More specifically, how it can be used to combat the issues surrounding the Indigenous population's overrepresentation within the criminal justice system. So, who are the Indigenous people? The Indigenous people are the original settlers of these North American lands and have thrived on these lands pre-European contact for thousands of years. They may identify themselves as either First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, and there are approximately 1.8 million self-identified Indigenous people within Canada, which makes up about 5% of the total Canadian population. There are approximately 700 different Indigenous communities in Canada, speaking 86 different Indigenous languages within these communities. As the friendship model could be applied to many different cultures, I have chosen the Indigenous peoples specifically to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within the criminal justice system. For instance, the Indigenous adults make up 4.1% of the overall Canadian population. But of that percentage, 30% are provincially incarcerated and 27% are federally incarcerated. When you apply these kinds of statistics to the Indigenous youth, the numbers are much greater. Indigenous youth make up 8% of the overall Canadian youth population, but of that population, 50% of Indigenous youth are incarcerated. So why this overrepresentation? To answer this question, it is important to discuss the effects of colonialism on the Indigenous people. The Indigenous population has faced many traumatic challenges post-European contact. This includes the epidemic levels of disease and famine, being absconded from their lands, displaced to small areas within and from their original territories. As well, residential schools were used by the Canadian government in partnership with the Catholic Church to assimilate the Indigenous peoples into a more westernized culture, and then, in a sense, and as a result, stripping them from their own culture, as some would come to say was a form of genocide. Alongside the residential school programs, in the 1960s, Indigenous children were taken from their families as it was thought that the Indigenous peoples were incapable of properly raising children. This form of racism was and still is at a systemic level, where policies and laws are laid out that apply restrictions specifically to the Indigenous peoples. The result of all these traumatic experiences over a century is intergenerational trauma being passed down from generation to generation, resulting in a complete breakdown of family, community, and a much needed support system. This gross imbalance of these three elements within the Indigenous nations could be argued that is directly related to the reasons that this population has the highest levels of mental health issues and addiction of any population in Canada. So when you take into account the mental health issues and addiction as a result of the intergenerational trauma, and this is due to colonialism, then you add the fact that the criminal justice system is formed from a colonial ideology, then also take into account the systemic racism in the form of policies and laws, it is clear that a more culturally appropriate solution is needed. So this is where the friendship bench model comes in. It's developed by the designer Dixon Chibanda, and it would provide a much needed culturally appropriate mental health care for the Indigenous. It was originally implemented within Zimbabwe communities, where grandmothers of Zimbabwe culture with psychotherapeutic training provided by the program would sit on wooden benches that were intermittently placed within these communities. Anyone could come and sit with the grandmothers from up to 6 sessions, and to which at point they would be referred on to the appropriate service that was deemed the priority. For instance, like housing or parenting, or maybe even more counseling sessions. The model also includes an online option for allowing even more people to engage with these grandmothers, removing any geographical issues that may exist. So how can this be applied to the Indigenous communities, and in which ways does it help with the overrepresentation issue that I discussed in the previous slides? Well, it can be applied in a similar manner as it had been done in Zimbabwe. But of course, less maybe the bench being outside. I'm now picturing this elderly grandmother sitting on a park bench outside during a Canadian winter, so waiting for someone to sit beside them. So probably designate indoor areas that are easily accessible to everyone in the community, and rather than just grandmothers, it would also include elders. Elders hold a great deal of significance to the Indigenous people. Not only are they regarded as people that hold experience and a great deal of knowledge and wisdom, but are also looked at as healers of the mind, body, and spirit. The program would, of course, still include psychotherapeutic training and counseling training, and most importantly, would be very culturally significant, as elders would use cultural forms of communication, such as telling stories and singing songs. Where this addresses the overrepresentation issue is where it provides a sense of community and support system from a cultural perspective. It's in these three elements, the loss of community, the loss of support system, and the loss of culture, that it can be arguably, an argument could be made that is the main contributing factors in why there is this overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within the criminal justice system. There are Indigenous programs that are very similar to the Friendship Bench model. One of them is the Maskiki Wellness Program, where, as with my idea, elders are used as consultants that have psychotherapeutic and counseling training. There are online meetings that are organized every month with elders where they share and teach traditionally based wisdoms passed down from generation to generation. The goal is to form and repair the community and support system that was lost so long ago. Another example is the Wellness Nation. And again, this is within the heart of the communities, adheres to traditional and cultural methods within their wellness programs. The interesting thing about the Wellness Nation is they come from the direction of the physiological, believing that a healthy body can heal the mind and spirit. The program includes fitness and training regimes that include traditional Indigenous foods. The program also includes the Wellness Warrior campaign. What this is it celebrates Indigenous individuals that have been actively working on their wellness of themselves and of their communities. This can involve anyone in the community, including elders, youth, grandmothers, traditional knowledge keepers, and community leaders. Alongside these programs, they have an app that can be downloaded by anyone to an electronic device, and this would give the individual full access to all the information, meetings, exercise videos, as well as the traditional food recipes and cooking videos and guidelines. In conclusion, the Indigenous people have been for thousands of years and continue to be a vital part of these North American lands. The overrepresentation of this population within the criminal justice system can be directly linked to the traumatic events from colonialism, and that have resulted in high levels of mental health and addiction issues within the Indigenous population. Since the criminal justice system is formed from a colonialism framework, there is a much greater need for a more culturally appropriate solution for this overrepresentation problem. I surmise that the Friendship Bench model would be an excellent model to combat this issue, as it would be applied within the heart of the Indigenous communities and would provide the three vital elements of family, community, and a support system that were so severely damaged as a result of the colonialism and systemic racism. I was happy to see within my research for this presentation that there are existing Indigenous programs similar to Dixon Chibanda's Friendship Bench model, and such as the Muskegee Wellness Program and the Wellness Nation. Though they come from different directions of mental health care, Muskegee more psychotherapeutic and the Wellness Nation more physiological, they both focus on the mental health care from the cultural perspective while including the very important elements of family, community, and support systems that are freely accessible and applied to all willing to participate. The healing properties from these programs is boundless, as they provide the Indigenous people with a much needed sense of belonging. Thank you. That was my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.